Hey guys, welcome to the Unleash podcast brought to you by Hidden Gen, where we talk about how to unleash your hidden potential. I'm your host, Yuri Diogenes, and we have a great episode for you today featuring Chris Prosser. Thanks a lot for being here today, Chris.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Before we jump into today's topic, we'd like to invite you to subscribe to this podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. Also, you can always find this podcast at Hidden Gen website, hiddengen.net. And if you live in the area and you have not been at Hidden Gen yet, feel free to visit the website and grab a free trial pass. Again, hiddengen.net. Chris Prosser, aka Coach Chris. How's it going?
Yep. Definitely. Good. AKA the Games Dog. I think that's my more popular
Oh, really?
nickname.
Okay, cool. I didn't know
Yeah.
that. All right, Chris. So let's start talking about the fat loss cycle. I know that you have
Sure.
some ideas and principles around that. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fat loss cycle really helps us sort of understand why a topic, what we're talking about today, fat loss nutrition, why it's important to discuss it. And the cycle, and this isn't a hard and fast thing. It changes, there's people that probably experience variants of this, but the fat loss cycle, in my experience over the last 8 years, has been people, they will get some sort of degree of motivation to say, hey, I'm going to lose some fat, I'm going to lose some weight, get in better shape. So they start doing little things here and there. Maybe they say, hey, I'm going to stop drinking 3 Dr. Peppers a day or whatever it may be. They start making little changes. A couple of weeks go by, they're not seeing as much results as they feel like they should for the amount of effort that they're putting in. So one or two things happen. Either they quit right then and there, or they'll try something a little bit more extreme. Once they get burnt out of doing that, they practically are going to end up right back to where they started, either in the same shape as they were before or even worse shape. And so it's this cycle that people continuously find themselves in, but it's because people don't know how to address and how to approach their nutrition.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's interesting that this is very common, mainly for athletes or weekend warriors, right? That they
Yeah.
used to exercise more on the weekend. So, from your experience, what are the most common reasons people fail through this fat loss process?
So there are a few reasons, and I'm sure we could have a laundry list. But the three main ones that I see, first, there's way too much information available. If you go into Google and type in best diet to follow for fat loss, I'm sure you're going to get something like 85 million results in about half a second. So there's way too much information. People don't know what applies to them because not everyone has a nutrition or a kinesiology degree where they can decipher what information is relevant for them.
Hmm.
So there's too much information. It's really confusing. People tend to focus sometimes on the wrong factors of their nutrition. And I like to talk a lot about over reliance on supplementation, which is something that will probably be a recurring theme in this conversation. But people will put a lot of effort on choosing the right supplements, but not worrying so much about what their calorie intake is, and then are confused why they're not losing weight. So too much info, people focusing on the wrong aspects of their diet. And then the final one, which I mentioned this in the fat loss cycle, people find themselves in is they will follow an unsafe or unsustainable practice. And sure, maybe they'll see some results sort of quickly over a few weeks, but because it's not sustainable, they get burned out, they give up, and then they either gain the weight back or they gain even more
Yep.
weight. And so, in my experience, those are really the three key reasons. When people set out to lose fat, they just don't get the types of results they're looking for.
So based on that, what will you consider the most influential components of the weight loss?
Sure. So when we look at a diet, and also real quick, I'll say too, when we say diet, a lot of people think that means that you're following some sort of set plan. A diet is whatever you eat, good or
Yeah,
bad,
yeah.
right? So I kind of like to level with that terminology. But there's five components of any diet. There is what we call energy balance or calorie balance. So calories coming in versus calories going out. We have macronutrient breakdown. So how much protein, carbs, and fats are you getting? We have the timing of your meals. We have meal composition. And then we also have more secondary things like
Hmm.
supplements. Okay. So when we're looking at the most impactful calories, and this was done pretty much shown in research over several meta-analysis, or one meta-analysis, I should say, over several research studies. They pretty much been able to identify that calorie intake, so how many calories are you eating versus how much are you burning, contributes about 50% of the total impact or result that you're looking to see. So if you're looking to lose weight, your calorie intake, if you're not following that, you're going to have a really challenging time seeing any type of positive
Yeah,
progress.
makes sense.
Yeah.
There are also so many types of diet nowadays. People get lost, as you said.
Sure.
There's the amount of information, and I'm pretty sure that you have some advantage and disadvantage that you could list about the different approach, like flexible diet, structured plan. What do you think about that?
Sure. So, flexible dieting versus structured dieting. Again, we'll kind of just level set with some terminology. So, for people watching who may not know, structured dieting is practically going to be a meal plan where everything's pre-written for you, the foods, the portions, all of that good stuff. So it's very rigid. And it's the opposite of a flexible diet, in which you generally have more macronutrient guidelines and maybe a food list that you get to choose from. So it's not as rigid. There's a lot more options. Okay. In terms of which one's more advantageous, I don't know that I would say one is better than the other, because in my practice as a nutrition coach, I actually leverage them both with almost every client I work
Hmm.
with. It's just it's more so dependent on when is it appropriate to leverage one over the other.
And also depends on each person, right? Some people
Yeah,
will actually
absolutely.
demand to be more flexible, and some other people
Yeah.
they work better when it is very well structured.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that comes down to people's kind of their pre-existing behaviors or their habits. Some people say, "Hey, my habits are really crappy, and I need the
Hmm.
structure, because if I have too much freedom, I'm not going to follow a
Right.
plan." And then there's other people who say, "Hey, if I've got to eat the same thing every day, I'm going to get bored, and that's going to lead to me binge eating or going way off
Hmm.
track." So yeah, it definitely depends on the person for sure.
And how to determine, because you mentioned this about calorie deficit. So how to appropriate measure what you need, right? The appropriate deficit.
Oh, so yeah. So one thing too that we could say on this, another way to frame the question is, how do we determine appropriate rate of
Hmm.
loss, right? So when we're looking at creating a calorie deficit, at least how I look at it is, I want to client that's going to be sustainable, but also keep them motivated. If you go several weeks, you're not losing any weight, that could be a little discouraging. So I like to kind of find a middle ground to where we can lose at least a little bit of weight each week to keep them motivated and engaged. I will say most people tolerate anywhere between a half a pound to about a pound and a half weight loss per week. So, in terms of the actual deficit itself, if it takes 500 calories of a deficit per day, or let's say 3,500 calories per week to lose 1 pound of fat, you can kind of use that number to gauge, okay, if I want to lose a half a pound, well, it'd be half of a 3,500 calorie deficit, right? And one thing too, I'll add on that is it's really important. People seem to think, well, when I want to lose fat, I should just take out my calories. And I would actually advise against only doing that. Yes, take out some food, but also consider increasing your activity. So instead of just removing food, you're going to run out of food really quickly. You can increase your activity. So if you see people doing 30 minutes of cardio and then they do it 45 minutes and so
Hmm.
on, there's other ways that you can create a calorie deficit rather than just taking all your food. Because if you do that, you're going to bottom out really quickly.
Yeah, and also will be important. I know that this is not every nutritional coach talks about that. I know that Greg talks about that a lot, which is know your rest metabolic rate, right? It would be ideal for
Sure.
you to know that information, and I know that at Hidden we do have professionals that do this type of measurement.
Sure. Yep, absolutely. It's very, very helpful information to have. And sometimes, people don't have, like, if we have remote clients, for example, they may not have access to that sort of, I guess you'd say lab
Hmm.
equipment, or how the various ways that they can check for your basal metabolic rate. We have other sort of workarounds that we like to use for that, just getting in the right ballpark in terms of a person's actual calorie needs.
Yeah. Now, let's say I have all that. I have hired the right coach. I have the appropriate diet. How long should one follow a fat loss diet? Um, there is a predetermined amount of time, or it's based on the person's goals. How you determine that?
Really great question and a really important question. So, in terms of how long to diet, it's going to range, right, from person to person. And there's some sort of client by client things that we'll look for in terms of just markers. So, we may ask the client, hey, how's your appetite, or how's your energy
Hmm.
levels? How are you recovering in the gym? What's your rate of progress each week? And those are things that are obviously going to be individual to every
Yep.
person. A general rule of thumb is usually around 12 weeks of being in a calorie deficit. Our bodies are insanely smart and they are able to adapt. So if you were in a calorie deficit for usually about 12 weeks, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, again, based on the person, what's going to happen is there's going to be some metabolic changes going on that are actually going to work against your body losing fat. And in order to reverse some of those metabolic changes, what we could do is consider taking what a lot of people refer to as a diet break, in which case you can bring your calories up to maybe your maintenance level for a couple of weeks, and then you can progress back into a deficit. But the important thing here is not to diet continuously. I hear a lot of people diet for 6 months or a year straight. You can certainly do that, but in terms of actually keeping your progress and keeping steady progress, I would recommend, about 12 weeks of hard dieting, and then pulling back for at the very least about 2 to 3 weeks. But ideally, about half the time you spend in a deficit, you should come up to a maintenance level. So if you do 12 weeks of dieting, 6 weeks at a maintenance level. But I know, that's going to be based on the individual and what they can
And
tolerate.
what is your take on cheating meals? Do you think it's helpful?
Sure. I mean, again, that's going to be a huge thing with adherence more so. I know that there's a lot of debate on the hormonal responses and that sort of thing. So I won't really state my stance on that. But I think cheat meals, they have a place, especially like if we look at competitive bodybuilders. As we're getting closer to competing, cheat meals can certainly be helpful for carving up things like that when your appetite may be kind of wonky. And also just for general population people, if they are following a structured meal plan, knowing that, 1 or 2 times a week that they're going to get an unscripted kind of off the books meal that they can just enjoy themselves, be it a date night
Yeah.
or a party that they're going to do. That we have seen that tends to help people a lot more on the adherence side, knowing that there is going to be a little bit of a break on a weekly
Yeah,
basis.
and it helps them to keep motivated. I think it's
Yeah.
psychological is very important. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, um, there is also the concept, because you just mentioned about 12 weeks and then a break. Would be this break consider a recovery diet?
Sure. I mean, so again, it's going to be based more so on the intensity of the deficit. So again, if we kind of compare a competitive physique athlete versus a person who's maybe just looking to lose weight to get in better shape, probably going to be a different answer. Because the person who's doing a very extreme and intense diet, such as a competitive bodybuilder, because their calories are usually low and their workload is usually very high. So it's going to be a little bit of a different impact on that individual than the person who is, let's say, averaging half a pound to a pound of fat loss per week. I don't know that I would necessarily call it a recovery diet for the general population person. Like I said, unless they're dieting just really, really hard and their workload is really high.
So so
But
so
yeah,
ba- so
for
based on
general,
that, what is really the objective of the recovery diet?
so with a recovery diet, um, we're mainly looking, and this too, a lot of people may be saying recovery. I thought it was called a reverse diet, and we can get into that at some point. But a recovery diet is just that. Our goal is to recover from some of those metabolic adaptations that I mentioned earlier, slowing down your metabolism. Some people may experience changes in their hormones, things like that, appetite, energy. We want to pretty much pull the person out of that. I wouldn't call it a starved state because that would be a pretty extreme term to use, but that dieted down state to where for a while they have been getting less calories than what their body needs to function
Mm-hmm.
properly. So our goal with the recovery phase is to bring the person out of that, get them to where they can, not be as food focused, their appetite can be good, their sleep, their energy levels, their mood, even their performance in the gym, all that stuff we want to bring back to optimum levels.
Makes sense. So since you mentioned the reverse, so what would be the difference between those two?
So, and now this is a huge debate. Which one's better, recovery versus a reverse diet? A recovery diet is just like we said. The goal is to get your body back to a healthier state faster. As to a reverse diet is to slowly but surely bring you out of a calorie deficit. And we really see the term reverse diet used a lot again in the world of bodybuilding. So people who don't compete probably will never have to worry about a reverse diet ever. You are slowly bringing up a person's calories to prevent excessive fat gain while trying to get them back up to either their maintenance or even surplus level.
Okay.
And yeah, so that's the main difference is recovery is a lot faster of a process. The reverse diet is a lot more long, sort of deliberate and drawn out.
So for the recovery, since it's for the general population, what is the timeline? I mean, how long usually it takes?
So, like I was saying, generally speaking, I mean, I think in an ideal world where we're all super patient and we're okay with like kind of going through the process, I would say generally at least half of the time that you spent in the deficit, you could spend in a recovery phase. But I get not people are impatient, and that's fine. People, when they're motivated, they want to see the results, and that's fine. I would say if you diet for 12 weeks, which again is kind of my maximum that I recommend, I would say spend at least 2 weeks in some sort of recovery phase. But again, ideally, you should spend closer to about half the amount of time that you spent in that calorie deficit.
And since I'm changed my diet, how should I handle cardio, for example, which is something that we usually do more when we are on that restrict diet? During the recovery, do we cut cardio or in half, or do we cut completely?
A rule of thumb that I use, again, kind of, we have to be careful, right, what we say, because we may say one thing and people are like, hey, that's the only way to do it. So just kind of take this with a grain of salt. Generally speaking, I will cut cardio depending on what the person was doing. I'll usually cut it in half. I don't ever cut cardio completely, really, for any client of mine, just because, of course, the heart benefit. But during that recovery phase, again, like I said, we want the body to recover from that dieted down or that deficit phase that we just came out of. And so it makes sense to also kind of reduce the workload a little bit, not so much to where they're in a huge surplus all of a sudden, but we definitely want to bring them down a little bit so their central nervous system can have more resources to actually use towards recovery.
Yeah, because what I've seen a lot over the years is that people are in a strict diet for 12 weeks, mainly bodybuilders, and then 1 week after the show, they gain like 15 pounds, 20 pounds. It's like crazy, right?
Sure.
And this is super dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if we're being distinctive between, a physique athlete, for example, versus a general population person, there's different parameters that we kind of use of, hey, what was a successful recovery diet? For a bodybuilder, that's going to look quite a bit different than someone who, like I said, is maybe not dieting as intensely or not as strictly as a competitive physique athlete
Yeah.
would.
So, for example, for the recovery diet, you said that usually it's a half. So, if I did 10 weeks strict diet, I should do 5 weeks of recovery, right?
Ideally,
Eh,
yes. And like I said, some people won't want to spend that time. But that's kind of my
Mm-hmm.
rule of thumb is if you're going to diet really hard for 10 weeks, you're going to be doing your body a favor to give it at least some time to recover and remind your body, hey, I'm not dying, I'm not starving to death, I'm
What
okay.
about the reverse? If the recovery is half, how long is the usually is the reverse?
So I'll be honest with you. I am not one that's ever practiced the reverse diet just because I've been a firm believer um, pretty much my entire career in the recovery diet. So I've never practically ran a reverse
Hmm.
diet. I've just, seen of other coaches that do it. So I don't know. I wouldn't be the best person to answer that question in terms of how long a reverse diet could run.
But
But
it's
based on what
usually
I've
is
seen,
longer than the recovery. I mean, the rule of thumb is that, right?
well, a good way to look at it is this. If you're trying to compare and contrast recovery versus reverse diet, let's say, for the sake of it, that they both run four
Okay.
weeks after the dieting phase. Okay. The difference is in that 4 weeks with the recovery diet, you're going to feel really good probably about 2 weeks in. As to where the reverse diet, 2 weeks in, you're still going to be probably either in a deficit or barely hitting your
Oh,
maintenance level.
I
So
see.
you haven't
Yeah.
given yourself the amount of,
So
yeah, exactly. You haven't given
it's not
yourself the
really
amount of,
about the time length. It's more about you're gonna feed more slowly your body with the with right.
correct.
Okay. Yeah, makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Yep, that's exactly right. Being more aggressive, pretty much, and of course, we don't just shove tons of calories down when we're starting the recovery. But the goal, like I said, is to get to a point where your body has the resources that it needs to actually recover from the
Oh,
deficit that it
so
was
let's
just
just
in.
use an example here. If I have a 2,000 calories strict diet for 12
Yep.
weeks, how much would be approximately my recovery? 2,500.
How I would look at that. So if you dieted at 12 or 2,000 calories for that amount of time, we would also need to know, well, where did your calories start? So let's just say for this example, let's say they started at 2750,
Okay.
right? That was your starting calories. You dieted down to 2000, which for a lot of bodybuilders, they may say, hey, those are my exact calories because it's pretty common, right? Those are pretty general numbers. Um, so what we would look at is, okay, how long were you at the 2000 calories? If you're at the 2000 calories, maybe for only the last week or so, what I would do is I'd say, hey, right off the bat, I'm going to give you 2200 calories and we'll see how you do. A marker that I like to use to sort of determine the amount of calories that we'll add in is a percentage of what they were at their lowest during the deficit. Person weighed 200 pounds at the lowest point of their deficit. I try to be within anywhere between about 4 to maybe 7 or 8% above that number by the fourth week. So if we need to dial the calories down, we can do that. A lot of people will see, hey, we actually need to pump the calories up quite a bit. And if take into consideration as you start eating more, you may be holding more water. And so there's water weight fluctuations and all that sort of stuff. But generally, we can get an idea based on that lowest number that they hit during the deficit and kind of knowing, like, okay, if we can get them about 5% above that weight, they're going to be pretty much recovered.
That's cool. That's pretty cool. Um, and during the recovery phase, let's say that I'm going through a 4 weeks recovery. What should I
Sure.
completely avoid?
I would completely avoid binge eating, things like that. And the best way to do that would be, now this is a recovery diet, in my opinion, is a really good time to use a structured meal plan. We talked about this
Yeah.
earlier. When should you use one or the other? Just because it is very tempting for a lot of people to say, hey, I've been dieting, so I'm just gonna, open up the floodgates a little bit and kind of eat what I want. But unfortunately, for a lot of people, the discipline's just not there to really say, hey, I can stick to the macros and eat relatively good. Most of the time, once you take off those restrictions, a lot of people are just like off to the races with, kind of going way off the script. So this is the time to meal plan and then slowly transition a person into that more flexible. I've even used hybrid approaches where half of their daily intake is structured. So I tell them exactly what to eat, And then the second part of the day, maybe a snack and their dinner, I'll say, hey, here are your macro guidelines. So it at least, kind of gets them in that right mindset of, hey, I do have some parameters that I need to follow here, and prevents them from just going completely off the rails.
Excellent. That's great. Now, Chris, you had a lot of clients, and I'm pretty sure that you already recognize that some clients will be more successful than others.
Sure.
You may have the same diet or the customized diet. I mean, but you have the persona, but they act differently. So, in your experience, what really makes the ones that are successful be successful? What are some of the attributes that you see, and why the other ones are with having you as a coach are not so successful?
So a lot of this will go back to what we talked about early on. The reasons that people fail, whether they're a client of mine or they're doing their own thing, it's really the same reasons that a person would fail or succeed. But to your point of the ideal client, the people that see the best results, number one, they are willing to get a plan and they're willing to stick to that plan. I've seen, and this kind of goes back to that fat loss cycle we talked about, is people are looking every which direction. There's so much information. There's 30,000 diets that they can try. And so they'll try one diet for a week. That one doesn't work. Then they move on. And consistency is one of the greatest, probably influencing factors in the success of any program, whether you're trying to gain muscle, lose fat, doesn't matter, become a better athlete. Consistency is the most important factor. So people are willing to get a plan. They're willing to stick to that one plan and give it time. Not to say that that plan shouldn't change over time, because it certainly should. But that's why people hire a coach,
Mm-hmm.
is to monitor and make adjustments. But being willing to stick to that plan, give your body time to actually see results. Another huge thing is people who are successful, they really early on will start focusing on building new habits rather than just relying on motivation. So motivation is a finite resource. You can only be motivated for so much and for so long. However, if you build a new habit, that can last you the rest of
Yeah.
your life. And so the people who are successful, they make a lifestyle change. They don't just say, well, I saw a picture, or maybe I'm going to the beach and I want to look good. So they get that kind of spark of motivation. But the problem is that's going to go away eventually. So people that can focus on new habits early on are going to be the most successful. And then finally, I'd say that people approach their diet with a longer term mindset. So a lot of times, I mean, especially here in the US, people, we're used to picking up our phone and practically getting anything we want at the press of a button. We're used to quick, and when we want it now. With, physique progress, especially, we have to look at the big picture in the long term. It's not going to happen
Mm-hmm.
overnight. So if you can go into it with that mindset, you'll have a much easier time, and you have a lot more realistic expectations, which will help you in the longer term.
During this pandemic, based on the clients that you work and based on just general observation, you think people gain or lost weight?
Um, well, based on how busy we've been, I'd say a lot of people probably, unfortunately, especially when the gyms were closed down, probably lost sight of their fitness a little bit. And we did see quite a bit of people reaching out and wanting to get back in shape. And so, yeah, I think COVID was really hard because you can't be shut down. And a lot of people did really great at adapting and creating those new habits, like we just talked
Mm-hmm.
about, and the others who didn't, um, you know, now that things are slowly starting to open again, thankfully here in Texas, they are
Mm-hmm.
open. People can, start to generate those new habits now that they have the opportunity.
Yeah, I've seen some people that actually were able to establish a routine, having a better discipline because they were working from home and preparing healthy
Yeah.
food. So at the same time that I understand that statistically speaking, people actually gain weight, I've read that. I know some
Yeah.
people that were able to do exactly the opposite by having a
Yeah.
more structured meal plan because they have the meal at their kitchen and everything was there. They didn't have to go out to eat, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and to that point, I think I had a client last year. He ended up competing at one of the first shows, that Texas hosted after some of the restrictions were lifted. But his entire prep was while the gyms were closed. But he ended up losing about 35
Wow,
pounds during the
that's awesome.
pandemic. But it was just it came down to habits and discipline, and he made it
Hmm.
work. So yeah, that's exactly right. There are some people who rose to the occasion and found a way. They're like, no matter what, I'm gonna prioritize my health. Which, as we know, for any sickness or virus, that your physical condition is a huge impact on whether or not how sick you can get, things like that. It definitely has great
Yeah,
impact.
yeah. All right, Chris. Great chat. A lot of good insights. Amazing episode. Thanks very much for your time. Truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Look forward to doing this again, hopefully.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for your audience. Stay tuned. We're gonna have way more episodes for you.